This morning, we are continuing our message series all about the promises of God, where we're exploring 5 of the major promises found in the book of Genesis. And I am so excited about this series because I am an Old Testament girl at heart. I used to be a public school Bible teacher, and I would always tell my students that I loved teaching the whole Bible. I loved every part of it, but the Old Testament was my favorite. I love the Old Testament stories. I loved all my Old Testament classes. I even had fun learning Hebrew. To me, the stories of the Old Testament are so rich with meaning, and they get even better the deeper you dig. You know, past some of the stories we learned as children, like through the way these stories are echoed in the New Testament. You go deep into the world of the Israelites, down to the history of the ancients. And that's where you find the heart of a God who was so deeply in love with his creation. And he relentlessly pursued them despite their rejection, time after time, age after age, until the point where he came down himself to rescue them with the blood of his own heart. You know, the love story of God and God's people doesn't begin at Golgotha, but it begins in the garden. So this morning, I want to take a few minutes to go through this process together as we're going to look at a story that we've all heard or at least heard of. You know, maybe you sang the song, "The Lord told Noah to build him an arky." Or maybe you played with the toys as a kid, or maybe your parents painted the story on your nursery walls. And here I'm going to agree with the great comedian Tim Hawkins, who says, "Oh, what a great story to paint on babies' walls, you know, where God sends a worldwide flood to kill every living thing." I promise I'm not judging you if you did that. We have Noah's Ark toys and blankets and all that at our house too. I want you to think for just a second about where you first heard the story of Noah's Ark. What memories come up in your mind when you hear that we're talking about Noah's Ark? All right, so you know the kids' story, and this is where I want a little participation at home. So I'm going to trust that you're shouting these answers out. All right. The world became evil, and God regretted that he had made people, so he told a man named Noah to build an ark out of what kind of wood? If you said gopher wood, you get a point. Good job. And he did. And then the animals came how? 2 by 2. Yes. And here I'm going to give you a little nugget that's going to win you trivia points one day. It wasn't 2 of every animal. It was 2 of the unclean animals, the ones that they weren't going to eat. But it was 7 pairs of all the clean animals, the ones they would eat, as well as 7 pairs of all the birds. So put that one in your pocket for later. All right, so they get all the animals on the ark. God shuts the door, and then it rains for how long? 40 days and 40 nights? Yes. Gold stars for everybody. And the waters recede. Noah sends out a raven, and then he sends out a dove who doesn't come back with anything the first time, but then it comes back the second time with what in its beak? An olive branch. And that is where we get the international symbol of peace. So after a few more weeks, the ground was dry, and Noah and his family and all the animals leave the ark. They make a sacrifice to God. God puts a rainbow in the sky, and he promises what? Yes, that he will never destroy the earth by flood again. Fabulous job, everyone. I know you guys all were yelling out the answers at home. So that is the basic gist of the story. And there's a lot of good stuff in that telling of the story. God's provision, God's promise at the end. But what kind of a God do we sometimes imagine when we look at the story that way? You know, I've had people bring that up before. Like, what kind of a God would kill innocent animals? What about the innocent children who had nothing to do with any of this? What about the people who lived on the other side of the world and didn't know any of this stuff was going on? What about that? That seems like a really wrathful and angry God. Now, if you're going through the Jesus Storybook Bible with us in a 242 group, you're probably reading or getting close to reading this story. And there you know that the angry, vengeful God is not at all what this story is about. But let's dive just a little bit deeper together. All right, so first, we're going to talk about some historical context of this story. First, it's not the only one, by far. Did you know that just about every ancient civilization in the world has a flood story? All of them. And the flood stories that originate in Mesopotamia, which is like the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, like old stuff. If you remember learning about the Fertile Crescent in social studies class, those stories are remarkably similar to the details that are found in the Noah story, because that's where Noah lived too. This was an event that was told about from generation to generation as the people of the world migrated and spread. And even after they began to follow other gods, this story remained. And as these stories were passed down orally and committed to memory, no matter where the people were or what situation they were in, whether it be famine or war or slavery or exile, they would remember these ancient stories and they would sustain them in times of hardship. All right, you ready to dive a little bit deeper? Okay, so when you look at a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, or really in the Bible, the first thing you need to consider is the world behind the text, which is what we just did. What was happening in the world at that time? So now let's look at the intended audience and the world of the text. So let's start with the part that's indisputable. The intended audience was Israel, God's chosen ones with whom he had made his covenant to be their God and they his people. So, what was the situation of Israel when they received this written story? Well, we know that Noah probably wasn't like chiseling this story out as the boat was rocking. Like, he told this story, and it was passed down orally through the generations, like I said earlier. So it is written significantly later than the time it happened. And it seems that there are two specific times that this story was officially received by the people of Israel. So the first time was after they had escaped from 400 years of slavery and oppression. The Israelites were a people with no nation, no land. They had no specific faith system. And after 400 years, the God of their ancestors and the gods of the Egyptians were virtually indistinguishable in their minds. So the first time the Israelites received the stories of Genesis, it was to remind them of who God is and who they were. And the second time this story was officially received, and you can find this in Nehemiah 8, was when the people of Judah, the remnant of God's people, the remnant of the Israelites, were allowed to return to Jerusalem after 70 years of exile in Babylon. They were separated from their homes and their family. They were separated from their worship. Their temple had been destroyed. Their walls had been torn down. They had no king. They had no nation. And when they all gathered together in the ruins of their holy city, Nehemiah gets up in their midst and reads these stories to them once again to remind them of who God is and who they are. So how does Noah's Ark story do that exactly? All right. Are you guys ready to dive into some deep theological nerdism where we discuss the literary structure of ancient Near Eastern writings? I know you are. And that brings me to why I have this giant whiteboard up here. You know, it is a running joke in every Bible study I have ever led. At one point, I will cry out in exasperation, I wish I had a whiteboard right now. And usually some kind soul will bring me one the following week. So I was so excited we had one at the ready this time. All right, I'm going to flip it now. Here we go. All right, so don't get intimidated. Noah's Ark story is written in something called a chiastic structure. Chi was the ancient Greek letter that we know as X, and it basically means a chiastic story is one where the first half mirrors the second half. And a lot of times they do that to kind of focus the reader in, focus the listener in on what the main story is about. Like, what is the main story about? What does God want us to know? So the story of Noah's Ark actually does this. And this is a really simplified version of the chiasm in Noah's Ark. I mean, even the numbers are the same. Like the days and the weeks and all of that mirror each other as we're going through the story. So, it starts with Noah and his sons, and it ends with Noah and his sons. And then it talks about how all life on the earth was cursed, the ark, all living creatures. Then it talks about the food and how the animals come in and how Noah is responsible for these animals. And they go in the ark. It starts to flood. The waters increase, and the mountains are covered. Then we get to the main point, which I'll reveal in a minute. And then the mountains start showing up again. The waters go down. They leave the ark. The animals are again in human hands for food. It talks about how all living creatures on the earth are now blessed, not cursed. It talks about the ark again. And then it ends with Noah and his sons. Now, what this whole story is focusing in on, the main point of this whole story is found in Genesis 8:1. And remember what Justin says about when you see a big but in the Bible? This is a big but, all right? Circle it, underline it. All this stuff was happening. The flood, they couldn't see land. They had just been through this huge storm. But God remembered Noah. That is Genesis 8:1. That's it. The whole crux of this story is that God remembered Noah. And if you look at the story, it's bookended by Noah and his sons. See, the Israelites descended from Noah's son, Shem. Hence the word Semitic. It refers to the people who come from this line of Noah and lived in that part of the world. So these bookends instructed the Israelites to look at this story and hear, this story is for you. So pay attention. When everything in the world was wrong, God remembered you. When you felt like you were alone in your faithfulness, God remembered you. When it felt like the waters were rising and your land was gone, God remembered you. The land is still there. You will stop feeling like you're drowning. You will make it through this. You will be blessed. I promise. And when God sealed that promise, the very first promise in the whole Bible, he placed a beautiful rainbow in the sky to remind Noah and his sons and every generation after that God is never going to have to start completely over again. There will always be an olive branch somewhere. There will always be a faithful remnant. There will always be God. And God will remember. Now, does that mean that everything was smooth sailing forever and ever? No. Well, if you were paying attention a few minutes ago at the first part of the sermon, you know the answer to that. No. God's people faced some really rough times. Times when they thought it was the end. But when they were in slavery, Exodus 2:24 tells us that God remembered his promise to them. And when they were in the wilderness worshiping a golden calf, Exodus 32:13 tells us that Moses told God to remember his promises to them, and he did. When they had to go into battle and fight for their promised land, Numbers 10:9 says that God remembered them and was with them through that battle. When they were scattered all over the earth after being conquered because their rulers had forgotten God, Zechariah 10:8-10 promises that the faithful will remember God, and God promises to restore them. And when they had gone 400 years without hearing from God, and they were conquered by the Persians, and then conquered again by the Greeks, and then eventually conquered again by the Roman Empire, God remembered his people. And Galatians 4:4-7. So it tells us, when the fullness of time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law. God never forgot them. God never forgot his promise. And God fulfilled it. Not with floods or plagues or fire or smoke, but with a baby. A baby who would grow up and turn the world upside down by showing who God is. God heals. God restores. God forgives. And the real true law of love, God, is love and justice and truth and peace. And God sealed that promise not with the light of a rainbow, but with the blinding light that appeared as Jesus emerged from the tomb, saying, "This is who God is, and you are mine forever." All of you. Because the second half of our Galatians passage continues by saying, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, "Abba, Father." So you are no longer a slave. You're a child. And if you're a child, you're also an heir through God. Because of Jesus, all the promises made by God to Noah and to Abraham and to Israel to be with them and sustain them and be their God and they be God's people, those promises are for us too. In fact, just a few verses earlier in Galatians 3:29, it actually calls us heirs of the promise. See, you can look at this story of Noah. You can see yourself in these bookends right here. When it feels like you're all alone in doing the right thing, God remembers you. When it feels like your skies have been dark for months and months, God remembers you. When the waters are rising and you feel like you're about to capsize, God remembers you. I want you to think about, what promise of God are you holding on to right now? What promise is carrying you through your storms? Did you know that there are over 7,000 promises in the Bible? 7,000 things that God said he would do for his children. On almost every page, God is whispering to you, "I made you. I love you. I will never forget you, no matter what." So if you ever need a reminder, when it feels like you're adrift and there is no end in sight, when it feels like you're alone and ridiculed, like the work you're doing is hard and you don't see an end, there is always a place you can turn to show you just who God is, just who you are. Receive the benediction with me. Be strong and courageous, confident of who you are. You are beloved children, always on the mind of your heavenly Father. Do not be afraid or terrified of anything, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you. He will never abandon you. He will never forget his promises to you. Thank you so much.